Montana Territory, spring of 1883. The wind howled low across the wide valley when Elias North saw her stumble out of the trees. He had not spoken a word aloud in almost 5 years. He stood on the porch of his cabin, a coffee tin cooling in his hand, watching the woman limp through the brush like she had nowhere else in the world to go. Her dress was torn at the hem, her coat hanging loose over a rounded belly. She looked ready to collapse, her boots soaked through and hands shaking from the cold. Elias set down the tin. He stepped off the porch. She stopped when she saw him. Her eyes went wide for a moment, then cautious. She did not speak. Neither did he. He raised one hand slowly and pointed to the cabin. She hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the fire was already warm. He pushed a chair closer to the hearth and motioned for her to sit. She lowered herself with a soft groan, one hand bracing her back, the other over her stomach. She had not yet said a single word, but her eyes followed him as he moved, weary, tired, yet somehow unafraid. He handed her a blanket. She wrapped it around her shoulders and looked at him. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said finally, her voice dry and hoarse. She swallowed. "I needed somewhere safe." Elias gave a short nod. He turned, ladled stew from the pot hanging over the fire, and set it in front of her. She stared at it, then at him. "Thank you," she whispered, and took the spoon with both hands. He sat across from her but did not eat. He watched her carefully, not with judgment, just quiet study. She was young, maybe 22, maybe 23. No ring on her finger. Her hands were calloused, like she had worked hard for a long time. Her eyes, though, they were older than her face. "My name's Marabeth," she said after a few bites. "Marabeth Gentry." He nodded again. Still silent. Her gaze dropped to her belly. "I'm 7 months along." He saw her fingers tremble just slightly on the bowl. "I walked for 2 days after the wagon broke," she continued quietly. "The man I paid to take me west left me behind when the river flooded. I guess he figured I'd slow him down." She looked up, and her voice cracked. "I haven't spoken to anyone since then." Elias leaned back slowly in his chair, arms crossed. She kept talking, like something in her had waited too long to say the words. "I was headed for Bitterroot. My aunt used to live there. But I do not know if she's still alive. I do not have anyone else." Still, he said nothing. She stared at him for a long moment, then gave a small, broken laugh. "You do not talk much, do you?" He blinked once. She shook her head. "That's all right. I do not mind silence." That night, Elias gave up his bed and unrolled a cot for himself by the hearth. Marabeth fell asleep quickly, one hand resting on her belly, the other clutching the blanket tight. Elias lay awake long after the fire settled into coals, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He had not spoken since the spring of 1878, not since the day his wife and child were taken by fever, the town doctor riding out too late. After he buried them, he left civilization behind. He found this land, built the cabin, and let the world forget him. He thought he was done with people. But now, there was a woman sleeping in his bed. A woman carrying life inside her. And somehow, she had looked at him, a man who had not spoken in 5 years, with a kind of ease he could not explain. The next morning, she was already up when he opened his eyes. She stood by the window, wrapped in his coat. The sun lit her hair, and her eyes were set on the trees. "I'll leave soon," she said without turning. "I just needed one night, truly. Then I'll be on my way." He walked to the stove, poured water into the kettle, and set it to boil. She turned then. "You do not have to look after me." He met her eyes. I'm not used to anyone being kind without expecting something in return." Elias walked to the cupboard and retrieved a tin of tea, set it on the table in front of her. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to him. She blinked slowly. "Thank you." Over the next 2 days, the snow fell again. Not heavy, but steady enough to make travel dangerous. Elias did not speak, But each morning he made her breakfast, and each evening he brought an extra firewood. When her coat tore at the seam, he brought out a sewing kit and set it on the table. She watched him move through the cabin with quiet certainty. He never asked her anything. Never pressed. But his presence. It felt like a hand on her back, steadying her without words. One afternoon, she stood at the doorway, watching him split kindling. She did not say anything at first. Just watched the way his shoulders moved, the calm rhythm he kept. When he noticed her, he paused. "I think you're the first man who has ever helped me without trying to own me," she said softly. Elias lowered the axe. "My husband left when I told him I was pregnant," she added, voice steady. "Said it was not his. Maybe it was not. Does not matter now." She looked down at her belly. "But this baby deserves better." Elias set the axe aside and walked over, snow crunching beneath his boots. He stopped a few feet from her, then reached inside his coat and pulled out a small carved figure, a horse, no bigger than his palm. He held it out. She looked at it, then at him. "You made this?" He nodded. She took it carefully, running her thumb over the smooth wood. "It is beautiful." It was not until that night, after they both sat by the fire in silence, that she reached over and placed her hand lightly on his. "You do not have to say anything," she whispered. "I hear you just fine." He did not pull away. For the first time in 5 years, Elias North felt something shift in his chest, not pain, not sorrow, but something softer. Something alive. Marabeth did not ask him for anything. But she gave him something just by being there. Just by looking at him like he was still a man worth trusting. And somehow, without saying a word, she had spoken to his heart. The river thawed in slow fits, the ice breaking apart with long, groaning cracks that echoed through the valley. Snows still lined the north-facing slopes, but the air smelled faintly of pine sap and wet earth. Elias repaired the roof while the weather held, and Marabeth sat near the tree-line, mending a shirt of his with quiet focus. She hadn't asked to stay. He hadn't told her she could. But neither of them brought it up once the roads turned to mud. There was too much to do each day that made the question unnecessary. "I've never had a place where the silence didn't feel like punishment," she said one morning while peeling potatoes by the woodpile. "Here, it's different." Like the quiet breathes. Elias paused in stacking chopped rounds and glanced at her. She didn't look up, but her mouth curved faintly, not with mirth, just ease. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked, brushing the peelings into a pail. He turned back to the stack and laid another piece in place. "Right," she said, wiping her hands. Foolish question. That night, she reached for the ledger he kept by the hearth. The pages were covered in neat, angular script, weather notations, planting dates, supply lists. She ran a finger down one page, then looked across the fire at him. "You write things down you won't say." Elias held her gaze until she looked away again. "I used to keep a diary," she added. "Back when I thought my days meant something to someone." She closed the ledger gently and didn't speak again that evening. By the second week of the thaw, she moved slower. Her back ached from the cot, so he built a second bed frame with spare lumber. She ran her hand along the joints when he finished, tracing the dovetails with quiet wonder. "You didn't have to do this," she said. He lifted one shoulder, then pointed to her swollen ankles. "You notice everything," she murmured. Spring sun spilled through the small window at dawn, catching the edge of her cheek as she slept in the new bed. Elias had taken to rising earlier, watching the horizon turn from violet to rose while the coffee brewed. The first time she joined him, she brought a tin cup and didn't say anything. Just sat beside him on the porch and watched the light stretch across the ridgeline. "I used to pray mornings like this would come," she said softly. "On the trail, in the dark. Just a place to stop. A place to be left alone." Elias didn't nod. Didn't move. But the quiet between them felt full. Later, while she boiled linens by the stream, she asked, "You had a family once?" He didn't answer. I can tell by the way you carry the grief. Like it's settled into your bones. She didn't press. Just wrung out the linens and hung them over the line behind the shed. That night, rain pelted the roof steady and low. She stirred in her bed, then rose with a hand pressed to her side. He met her at the hearth, already stoking the fire. I think it's time, she said, breath catching. Not yet, maybe. But soon. He fetched a basin and clean cloths without being told. You've done this before, she whispered. He dipped a cloth in warm water and held it out to her. Not with words, she said, voice unsteady. But you know what to do. The next morning, with the rain still falling soft outside, she stood at the window, one hand on the sill, the other on her belly. I think he'll come early, she said. Elias stood nearby, sharpening a carving blade. She turned to him. I've been thinking about names. He looked up. I'll wait to see him. But I want something strong. Something that means he belongs to no one but himself. Elias didn't speak, but later, while she rested, he carved another figure, this one smaller, shaped like a bear cub with rounded ears and a short snout. He left it beside her pillow. When she woke, she held it for a long time, then looked to where he sat at the table with a piece of rawhide in his hands. I never thought I'd feel safe again, she said. He didn't turn, but his hands paused just briefly. Whatever this is, she continued, it's more than I hoped for. Even if it ends tomorrow. He looked over then, met her eyes. She didn't look away. I don't want it to end, she said. Still, he said nothing. But she didn't seem to need the words. She nodded once, slow and sure, and lay back down, the carved cub held close to her chest. Outside, the rain eased to a mist. The ground drank deep and held. By late May, the frost had given way to green. The cabin sat nestled in a cradle of wild flowers and new grass, the trees overhead thick with leaf and birdsong. Elias repaired the fence along the southern edge of the pasture, hammering fresh slats into place while Marabeth moved slowly through the garden rows, easing down to her knees when she needed to plant and pausing often to breathe. You ever think about what you'd have done different if you'd known how things would turn out? She asked one afternoon, brushing soil from her palms. Elias straightened from the fence, eyes steady on hers. She nodded, answering her own question. I used to think I could outwork regret. Just keep moving, keep surviving. But it waits for you. Finds you when you're still. He rested his forearms on the top rail, silent. I don't want to survive anymore, she added. Not on scraps of kindness or fear. He watched her set a hand to her belly, not with worry, but with quiet resolve, as though she were making a promise to the child and herself both. Later, she found the small wooden cradle he'd built. It sat tucked beside the hearth, simple and smooth, the joints fitted without nails, just dowels and patience. She didn't say anything, just knelt beside it, ran her fingers along the curved frame, and exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for years. That night, she sat beside him on the porch and passed him a folded length of linen. I stitched it by hand, she said. It's not fine, but it'll hold. He unfolded it carefully. A swaddling cloth, soft and plain, with a single line of stitching in blue thread along the edge. I wanted something that came from me, she said. Something honest. He refolded it just as careful and laid it across his knee. I've been thinking, she continued, watching the last light fall behind the mountains. If you'd let me, I could stay. Not just until the baby comes. But after. He didn't move, but the stillness of him changed, like a door opening halfway. I wouldn't take more than I give, she said. I can work. I can trade. I don't need looking after. But I'd like to build something here. Something that lasts. The next morning, he left early and returned with a bucket of quail eggs and a small sack of flour. She stood in the doorway when he came back, her hands resting low and her face unreadable. You went into town? She asked. He nodded once. You didn't have to. He stepped past her, set the supplies on the table, and handed her a folded paper. A dried sprig of sweetgrass was tucked inside. Her eyes didn't leave his face. Why? He gestured toward the hearth, then to her, then finally to himself. The motion wasn't hurried. It was deliberate, like he was placing each word without sound. She took in the meaning slowly, her face softening. You want this? Us. He didn't look away. She stepped closer. I've never belonged anywhere before. He reached out, not touching her, but opening his hand between them. She placed hers in it. I'm not afraid anymore, she said. The wind stirred the grass outside, and the light in the room shifted, golden and warm. He didn't let go. And she didn't pull away. That night she moved her things into his room. Not with ceremony or hesitation. She folded her shawl over the foot of the bed and placed her book of hymns on the shelf beside his carving tools. He added no words. Just watched as she arranged her world beside his. Rain came again 2 days later, a warm summer storm that broke just after dusk. She woke with a start, one hand clutching the blanket, the other pressed to her side. It's time, she said. He was already on his feet. The hours stretched long and quiet, broken only by her breath and the soft rustle of cloth. Elias moved with calm precision, fetching water, holding her hand when she gripped it, bracing her back when her strength faltered. Just before dawn, a cry rose in the cabin, sharp and whole. She wept without shame, arms wrapped around the infant as if she'd been waiting her whole life to feel that weight. Elias sat beside her, not touching, but near. The baby had a full head of dark hair and strong lungs. Marabeth looked up, cheeks damp. Will you hold him? She asked. He hesitated, then took the boy with both hands, cradling him like something sacred. She watched, eyes tired but clear. I want to name him Alder. His gaze lifted. They grow on riverbanks, she said. Roots deep. They hold the soil. Even in floods, they stay. Elias looked back down at the child, then at her. Marabeth leaned against the pillows, voice a murmur. I know you don't speak. But you've said more to me than any man ever has. He sat beside her with the child in his arms, the fire casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the storm had passed. Inside, a new life had begun. Alder was nearly 3 weeks old when the mule wandered off. Marabeth had taken to walking the edge of the pasture each morning, the baby bundled snug against her chest. Elias would watch from the porch, arms folded, boots planted steady in the dirt, listening to the soft cadence of her voice carried on the breeze as she murmured to the child. That morning she returned with her brow drawn. The mule's gone. I checked the fence line, nothing broken, no prints heading out. Elias stepped off the porch and moved toward the lean-to, checking the latches. Nothing disturbed. He crouched, pressed his palm to the earth, then rose and nodded toward the ridge. I'll come with you, she said. He glanced at Alder, then back at her. He'll sleep most the morning, she said, adjusting the sling. If you're tracking, I should be close. You don't have to look back. They moved through the brush in silence, her steps slower, but steady. The trail curved uphill toward a stand of cottonwoods where the soil held the shape of a single hoof, turned sharply as if startled. Elias crouched, fingers brushing the edge of the print, then pointed toward the western slope. Cougar? She asked. He tipped his hand, uncertain. They walked another hour before they found the mule tangled in underbrush, unharmed but skittish. Elias approached slow, murmuring under his breath, not words, just sound. The mule calmed under his hand, and he unwound the lead from his belt. Marabeth stood nearby, watching the way his palm moved along the animal's neck. You have a way with things that don't speak. He didn't look up, but his hand stilled for a moment before he led the mule back toward the trail. At the cabin, Alder had stirred but not cried. Marabeth fed him on the porch, her back propped against the doorframe, the sling loosened. Elias returned from stabling the mule and sat beside her, the sun casting lines of gold through the pine above. I haven't told you what I did before, she said, her eyes on the baby. He waited. My father kept a smithy outside Independence. I worked the ledger, sometimes the bellows. He'd let me hammer pins on calm days. She smiled faintly. I was never good at it, but he said my mind worked clean. I wanted to take over when he got too slow, but he passed before I was old enough to own. She adjusted Alder's cap where it had slipped. The land went to my uncle. He sold it off by winter and sent me on. That's when I met the man who said he'd marry me. Her voice didn't falter. He liked how I held the hammer but hated when I spoke my mind. Elias watched her, one hand resting on the porch rail, fingers curled. I don't regret leaving, she said, but sometimes I wish I'd fought harder for that forge. She looked at him then. Do you miss it? Whatever came before this? He didn't glance away. After a moment, he stood and walked into the cabin, returning with a small box from the shelf. He opened it and set it between them. Inside were 3 flat nails, blackened and bent, their edges worn smooth. She reached for one. Did you make these? He nodded once. She turned the nail in her fingers. What for? He pointed to the cabin wall, to the beam supporting the hearth. You built the frame with your own hands, she said. He nodded again. I'd like to learn, she said, voice quiet. Not just mending or planting. Joinery. Framing. Maybe forge work, if we can get a bellows set up. She looked at him, waiting. He rose, walked to the shed, and came back with a square-headed hammer. He held it out to her. She took it slowly, not with surprise but reverence. I won't drop it, she said. The next day, he showed her how to set a brace and mark her measurements in charcoal. She didn't ask questions, only watched, then copied each motion until her lines matched his. Alder slept in the shade nearby, wrapped in a woven shawl. When he fussed, Elias took him up, holding the child without awkwardness, as if it had always been so. Marabeth glanced over and smiled, not with joy, but something steadier. I think he knows you, she said. He sleeps longer when you're near. Elias didn't respond, but he shifted Alder slightly, nestling the boy's head beneath his chin. By early June, they'd added a side room to the cabin, framed with pine and chinked with clay and straw. Marabeth laid the floor herself, each board measured twice. Elias carved a lintel for the doorway, and she painted a small pine bough on the beam above, the strokes careful and sure. That night, she stood in the threshold and turned to him. I don't want to be a guest here, she said. Not just the mother of your son's namesake. I want to be your equal. Your partner. He stepped forward, the door opened behind her, the firelight flickering low across the dirt yard. I want you, she said. Not out of need. But because you see me. And I've never been seen like that before. He reached up and touched her face, his hand warm and calloused. She leaned into it, eyes closing for a breath. When she opened them, he kissed her slow, certain, like a man returning to a language he'd once forgotten. And for the first time since he'd buried his past, Elias North let himself be known. The first frost of autumn laced the porch railings in silver, and the maples along the creek had turned to fire. In the still mornings, mist clung low in the grass, and when Elias stepped out to split wood, he could see his breath plume in front of him. Inside, Marabeth stood at the stove, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, a small basin of dried beans soaking beside her. Alder lay swaddled in a basket near the hearth, his cheeks flushed with sleep, one hand curled tight against his chest. You'll need to trap more before the freeze sets in, she said, not turning. The cellar's half full, and I've only got 2 jars of fat left. Elias nodded, setting the axe down by the door. He crossed to the table and unfolded the canvas bundle she'd stitched for his traps. Her needlework had grown finer, steadier. He could tell which stitches were hers now, even among the older seams. I'll keep the fire going, she added, brushing flour from her hands. And I'll start the hide scrap for Alder's boots. He reached for her hand and pressed it once before stepping back into the cold. She watched him go, her eyes lingering on the space where he'd stood. Then she bent and lifted Alder into her arms, wrapped him close, and hummed low under her breath as she moved about the room. By dusk, Elias returned with 3 rabbits and a fox, his coat damp from creek water and his boots caked in mud. Marabeth met him on the porch, a lantern in one hand. "You're bleeding," she said, pointing to the tear along his forearm. He lifted it, unconcerned. "Come inside," she said, already pulling the door open. "I'll clean it." She fetched the boiled cloths and the salve they'd made from lard and spruce gum. He sat while she worked, her fingers sure as she pressed the edges together and bound them. "I used to be afraid of blood," she said. "Now I just think about what comes after it." He looked at her, and she met his gaze. "You don't flinch," she said. "Not even when it hurts." He reached up, brushed her hair behind her ear. She leaned into the touch, quiet settling around them like a blanket. That night, they lay close beneath the quilt, Alder asleep in his basket beside the bed. Wind moved through the trees outside, soft and steady. Marabeth's hand rested over Elias' chest, her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. "I think I'd like to teach Alder how to read the land," she whispered. "How to tell when the deer have passed, or when a storm's coming by the shape of the clouds." Elias shifted, pulling her nearer. "And I want him to know the names of trees," she continued. "Not just what they're good for, but what they are. Alder, cottonwood, tamarack." She tilted her head to look at him. "Do you think we'll stay here on this land?" He moved his hand to hers, laced their fingers together. "I do too," she said. Before the first snow, Elias built a small forge behind the woodshed, the chimney low and the bellows stitched from elk hide. Marabeth's hands took to the hammer with rhythm, and before long, she'd shaped hinges, nails, even a horseshoe that sat now on the cabin door. She laughed the first time it rang against the wood in the wind. "I never thought I'd hear that sound and feel proud." Elias ran his hand over the curve of her back, and she leaned into him, her warmth steady and sure. When the snow finally came, it blanketed the valley in silence. Alder learned to walk, toddling unevenly across the floor, his hands outstretched. Marabeth reached for him each time he stumbled, her voice calm, never hurried. Elias carved him a little wagon with runner rails, and they watched from the porch as he dragged it through the snow, leaving a narrow trail behind. One evening near midwinter, Marabeth sat with a book open on her lap, Alder asleep against her side. Elias carved by the fire, working a length of ash into a smooth-handled spoon. She looked up. "Do you remember the first time you saw me?" He didn't raise his eyes but paused in his work. "I didn't know then, but I think I was already home." He set the knife aside, crossed the floor, and knelt beside her. She touched his cheek, her thumb brushing the faint scar near his jaw. "I love you," she said. "I've loved you since before I understood what that meant." He took her face in both hands, pressed his forehead to hers. No words passed between them, but she closed her eyes and smiled. Later that night, after the fire had burned low and the wind had calmed, Elias pulled out the ledger he once used to track weather and planting. He dipped the nib in ink and wrote slowly, the letters careful. Marabeth Gentry North. The words sat plain on the page, but they carried the weight of every moment since that first spring. In the spring that followed, they planted a new orchard just east of the garden apples, 2 saplings to start. Marabeth tied strips of muslin to the branches to keep the birds away. Alder tottered after her, dragging a tin pail filled with seeds. They built a second cradle that summer, smaller than the first. Marabeth rubbed her belly, already rounding again, and laughed when Alder tried to copy the sound of a crow overhead. As the sun dipped low and the trees cast long shadows across the yard, Elias stood beside her beneath the cottonwoods, his arm around her shoulders, her hand resting atop his. The land was quiet, but not empty. The past was buried, but not forgotten. And the future, wide as the Montana sky, stretched out before them firm beneath their feet, warm with promise, and lit by the kind of fire that never burned out.